Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, aneighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you.
Well, today we're going to discuss the matter of the Middle East and the conflict with Israel and Palestine from evangelical perspective. We want to know, how should evangelicals and Christians in general view this conflict that's unfolding. And I thought it would be great to have on someone who writes about this as a pastor and as a missionary, is Pastor Jim Fitzgerald. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, David. Great to be with you today.
Great. Now, you've got different articles for years going back to outlets like antiwar.com and the Aquila Report, which is like a reformed website. Then you've got American Greatness and other outlets that carry your articles. But you generally are someone that really thinks clearly and outside the box. I think thinking clearly and outside the mainstream media box is a synonym, right? It's a redundancy, right?
Correct. Yeah.
But someone that goes into that. It's rare to hear those kind of perspectives from someone who's an actual, in the game pastor and missionary. Most people in your situation who are missionaries or pastors really like to hedge their words and take a more quiet or confrontational approach. But you really are following the points and facts of history methodically in your articles. So in light of some of the different pieces you've done recently, where would you start off for folks who we're going to kind of have a dual lens here, both the broader Christian world, because I think that's fundamental, the morals of what does it mean to imitate Jesus, and then in particular, the evangelical kind of take on this from their particular emphases that they have. How would you start as a pastor, as a missionary? And I would say that you're just for audience sake, you're a missionary who's been over in the Middle East. How many years?
Since 2008. Yeah. So probably
you've been
15
what
years.
Countries have you been to, and how many days probably would you guess you spent over there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've been, my home base is in Egypt, and then I've been to Jordan, Iraq, and Tunisia, Morocco. So those are the main countries that I've been working in.
Your main job was to start the Arab Spring, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. You said that's my main job.
Yeah, you started mentioning all the countries. Like, was that 2008?
Yeah,
and then all the countries that had the Arab Spring. I was like, what's going on here?
Yeah,
you're pollinating something over there, right?
That's a correlation without causation.
It's like I have a aunt a great aunt who is in her 80s, and her parents were with the Red Cross in Ethiopia back when Emperor Selassie was still in charge. And when I told it to a friend of mine who used to be in military intelligence, he said, "Oh, how great! They were intelligence assets over there." I was like, "Oh, how that works? I didn't know." But anyways, no, that's not what you were doing. You're there to spread the gospel of theology. Tell us a little bit about what you do over there.
Correct. Yeah. So basically, I'm with Equipping Pastors International, and our main focus, our main purpose is to train pastors with biblical and theological education that, probably 80% of the pastors around the world don't have access to. And so, with pastors, elders, deacons, lay people, we try to provide a solid, robust theological education for them. We have New Geneva Theological Seminary in Egypt that is able to grant degrees. So we offer master's degrees and a doctor of ministry degree, and we've had hundreds of graduates over the years. And these people are all in ministry or in missions throughout the region, and they're pastors and teachers and so forth. And then another side that we did in cooperation with International Cooperating Ministries, I brought them over to Egypt back around 2010, I think, and we started building churches there. And over the, since that time, since around 2010 to the present, I believe we've completed 184 churches, church buildings, some of which are church plants, and then we also have some house groups in some of these countries, house churches or almost churches, but places where people can go and meet and worship and pray and disciple. Then we have also started a publishing ministry where we translate high quality biblical and theological books into Arabic, and then distribute those all around the Middle East. So all the books that we have translated have been to almost every country in the Middle East and North Africa, including Saudi Arabia, which, we had last year, about this time last year, we were in Saudi Arabia, and my distributor was distributing books there at the book fair. Book fairs are the way that books get distributed around the Middle East and North Africa. And he was invited to bring these books there, and he brought them. And so we had, a book on the Trinity, and a book on the person of Christ, and a book on the attributes of God, and a book on covenant theology, and so forth. We were sold about 40 or 50 of each copy of each one of those titles, and people were going around the book fair talking to their friends about the books. And then finally the police caught on and came over to my distributor, and they asked him what he was doing, and they detained him and took him in for questioning and so forth. But it turned out what happened was the Minister of Education himself is one that invited for him, sent him a letter asking him to bring the books. So they actually had to call the Minister of Education and bring him down, and he took responsibility for it, said, yes, I gave them permission, it's my bad. So you're not in any trouble, but you have to stop selling the books. Well, we'd already sold about 40 or 50 of each one of those titles, and then they confiscated the rest that we had there, which was about 50 more of each. And I believe probably the police are reading them now.
Yeah.
So those are the three main legs of the stool that we are involved in the Middle East and North Africa: seminary education, building churches, and publishing.
Yeah. So so has your time, you've been in the Middle East in 2008, that'd be like 15 years.
Yeah.
You, has your views on the, Middle Eastern situation, particularly as it pertains to Israel and Palestine's disputes, changed by being in the Middle East, or?
I'm sure they have. Yeah. I mean, I'm confident they have. But I try to avoid two things. I want to be a learner. I want to be a student of history and culture and so forth and peoples. And on the one hand, what I have, the error that I have seen in a lot of missionaries is that you become sort of an advocate for whatever countries you're in. And you develop sort of a defensive posture. So if anybody criticizes those countries, you stand up for them and so forth. And that has its place, but I try not to get caught up into that.
Yeah, they can
And
almost turn it to like a paternalism or something, right? Where you're like,
right, yes,
I know
exactly.
these people better than you do. You stay away from them. These are my pets or something. That kind of
Yes,
mindset.
yeah, exactly. And then on the other side of the coin, I want to learn and I want to understand, but mostly from a cultural, personal level, as well as a religious level, obviously. But so yeah, I mean, obviously, when you're in a region that long, you do learn things that you previously didn't know, and that does
Yeah.
change your attitudes towards that.
Yeah.
So one thing I try to do though is, to keep out that whole colonial aspect of things. I don't want to get caught up in any of that,
Right.
where, you're sort of the elitist that's there, the foreigner that's there. And, you're supposed to know better than the native people there. And I really abhor that type of mentality. I learn from them. I don't go there with an agenda to try to tell them what they need. I try to listen to them, and they tell me what they need, and then I try to do it for them.
Yeah. Yeah. When you look at the dispute in Israel, do you think that there's something that being in the Middle East, experiencing it in real time, and getting to fellowship with people of different faiths and ethnicities in the Middle East can benefit the average American if they were to have had that experience? What would that be? It's kind of a what could they glean from it in terms of having a
Right.
truthful perspective.
Yeah. So I think, the first thing for me is that you realize very quickly that, it's one thing to say, okay, Muslims, are against Israel, throughout the whole region. I think everybody knows that, for the most part. It's another thing to understand that primarily the majority of Christians in the Middle East are not in favor of Israel. Okay. They would be on the Palestine side of this question. And so they would be on, for the most part. I do know some exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, Christians in the Middle East are, on the Palestine side, not the Israeli side.
And when you say the Christians are on the Palestine side, they wouldn't be in support of Hamas, or would they?
Well, now, that's a complicated question. So, like, most of the Christians would be abhorred at, for instance, ISIS. Okay. I know many Christians, I know many Muslims that became atheists because of ISIS. How could God allow that? And if there is a God, what's going on here? The whole problem of evil kind of thing.
If there's a God, how do they get those brand new Toyotas that look straight out of the factory? That's what I still want to
know. And how'd they get all those American weapons if there's a God? And American Humvees. But the the thing about it, now, this is interesting because what Israel is trying to do at this point in time is to make an equation between ISIS and Hamas and see them as, sort of synonymous. They're the same entity. They're the same type of people, the same type of terrorist. And Hamas is every bit as evil and wicked as ISIS was. There may be a few Palestinians that agree with that, but not many. All right. I would say the majority of Palestinians, appreciate Hamas. But again, there's a minority that do not. Also, there's a tension between Hamas and between the Palestinian Authority and the West Bank. There is documentary evidence that Israel had a hand in encouraging, if not actually helping to create Hamas as an organization, because the Palestinian Authority was getting very powerful under Yasser Arafat. It was gaining momentum in the world stage internationally and in the UN and even in America. The Palestinian Authority's idea of a two-state solution for the Palestinian problem, the Jewish problem, was on everybody's tongue, and it was, gaining a lot of momentum. It was about to become a reality. And Israel needed a way to stop that, because Israel does not want the two-state solution, no matter how much they might say they do. They don't. They never have. And so they needed something to offset the Palestinian Authority. So they helped to create, and certainly encouraged, funded and financed what became Hamas. And they did so in conjunction with the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood started in 1928 in Egypt, and by the early 1930s, they were in the Gaza Strip, and they, as they sort of fell in and out of favor, depending on who was in power or whatever, whether it was the Ottomans or the British or whoever, they nurtured the indigenous Palestinians there in their methods of doing social work, education, but also they had an armed division, and which also became the armed part of what is now Hamas. Israel fostered that. They encouraged it. They were willing to put up with a certain amount of violence and a certain amount of civilian deaths in Israel, because they knew that as long as Hamas created trouble here and there, this intifada, or the first intifada, the second intifada, a few car bombings, a few bus bombings, whatever, then they could act like they were all enraged and say, see, we can't live next to these people. You can't force a two-state solution on us. And that worked, for a couple of decades. And Israel has a phrase called mowing the lawn. So they would go in there and they'd say, okay, every once in a while we got to go mow the lawn, meaning we got to go in there and kill a few Hamas. We got to kill a few Palestinians. We got to bomb a few buildings. Then things will settle back down, and then we'll pull back out, and we'll live together sort of for another year or two in peace.
It's ironic when you said mowing the lawn. When I was in Israel, I remember seeing the Valley of Megiddo where the Armageddon's supposed to happen, and I remember when I looked over at it, it was being nicely mowed like a football field. I said, "Dear God, that is the calm before the storm."
Yeah,
for that battle, Lord, it looks nicely green, and everything was really cut nicely. I was like, God, that's a little eerie.
Yeah.
I didn't think they would keep it so nice and manicured in preparation.
Right. Yeah, that's a term they use for killing Palestinians.
Yeah.
And so then what happened is the Palestinian Authority became like the Vichy government in France. Okay, they're basically collaborators. All right. And even Yasser Arafat, he was at first a terrorist, and then he became a collaborator with Israel. And so that's what really angers Hamas so much, and angers the Palestinians in Gaza so much, because they see this happening. Now, and so to answer your question, yes, there are some Christians in the Middle East who would, if not look favorably, they would look, as in terms of a usefulness of Hamas in terms of helping the Palestinians to get their own state, or for having a one-state solution, even where Jews and Palestinians are forced to live together, and govern together. This whole idea where people say, well, see, the people in Gaza, they elected Hamas in 2005. Hamas has governed that country since 2005. And look at it. It's a mess, and then now they're attacking us and everything. So the Palestinians are just as responsible for what happened on October 7th as, Hamas is. Well, the truth of the matter is there is no sense in which Hamas actually governs the Gaza Strip. Okay, they do not control the ports. Israel does. They do not control the fishing rights. Israel does. They do not control imports and exports. Israel does. They do not control permitting. Israel does. They do not control financing for like small business and so forth. Israel does. They do not control the border. They do not control the checkpoints. They do not control food and water that comes in and out. Israel controls all those things. And in fact, throughout much of the rural parts of Israel, of Palestine, Israel controls even how much rainwater can be collected by Palestinians. So there is no sense in which Hamas governs the Gaza Strip. All right, no real sense. Israel has governed Gaza from day one. All right, even when they pulled the settlements out of Gaza and left Gaza in 2005, 2006, they still maintain a rigid control of all governance within the Strip. So there is no sense at all in which Hamas governs Gaza. And so this is what's created the tension, all right? Basically, Gaza is an open-air prison. It's an open-air concentration camp. And since October 7, it's become a death camp. It's a killing fields.
What about the notion that I've heard this said a lot, that, the difference between Israel and Palestinians is that, Palestinians, whenever they have a dispute, they will hide behind, hospitals and children's places. They hide behind the innocent civilians as an asset for the world opinion game of PR, whereas Israel doesn't do that. Israel protects its, its vulnerable or whatever, and doesn't use them as human shields for PR campaigns. What's the reality of that?
I would love to talk about that. Okay, so on the attack on October 7th blows that myth out of the water. Okay. Number one, the kibbutzes that are 300 meters away from the border, from the fence, are a mixture of military and civilian population. Okay. And by the way, a lot of your right-wing Americans, I don't know why they're so big in favor of this, because the kibbutzes are socialist communist communes.
Yeah.
Okay. And the original Zionists that came from Europe set up, they were socialists and communists, and they set up communes there. So the kibbutzes are agricultural areas that are socialists and communists. They are interspersed with militaries. So civilians and militaries are living there first. That's why civilians and military got killed together. Okay. So that is the definition of a human shield, if you will. And that's true all through Israel. You have civilians, you remember Israel is a reservist army for the most part. Okay. So that means that if something breaks out, the guy goes inside and he grabs his uniform, puts it on, comes out, starts fighting. All right. Prior to that, he's a civilian, so they're interspersed. Israel has also used human shields. They have used Palestinians as human shields in many of these battles. All right. And so that's just a big myth. Gaza is the most densely populated 25 square mile by 5 mile wide strip in the world. Where on earth could they put military assets where there wasn't civilian population? It's impossible. There's civilian population everywhere. Okay. There's no room in Gaza to have a military base outside by itself, or military assets outside by itself with a flag saying, okay, we're over here, attack us here. I mean, that is just such a ludicrous premise to think, oh, we're going to put our military over here so that Israel knows exactly where to attack us. I mean, that is just the height of strategic stupidity.
Yeah.
And they went into these hospitals. They didn't find any human shields. They didn't find any Hamas. Okay. And the tunnels, like under the Al-Shifa hospital, those tunnels were built by Israel when Israel was there.
For what?
Israel built those tunnels.
For what?
To be underneath the hospital for whatever purpose they wanted them for. But they were on CNN. All right. Israel, one of Israel's ambassadors was on CNN, or one of their spokespersons, talking to Christine Amanpour, okay? And he confessed that they built the tunnels under there.
Yeah.
Right? Now, they've destroyed 7 hospitals, and they haven't found any Hamas inside these hospitals. And then they have these photo ops where they put all these 80-year-old rifles on the on the floor, all neatly arranged with, some grenades and some smoke bombs and some rocket launchers or whatever. And they say, see, this was all here by Hamas. Well, then look at the weapons that Hamas has carried. They're new, they're modern, they're state of the art weapons. So I mean, what's going on here? You got this AK-47 that looks like it came from World War II. So at any rate, that's all propaganda. Now, does Israel use human shields? Yes. Does Hamas use human shields? Probably yes. Okay. So this whole idea of one accusing the other of the same thing, they both do, but it's not. I don't think it's so much that they're grabbing a hostage around the neck and saying, "Okay, if you shoot me, I'm going to kill them." What it is like we're talking about a densely populated area. It's impossible to separate these two things.
Yeah.
And so,
is it true in the past? There's been some allegations in past conflicts that Israeli soldiers would shoot at the private parts of little 10-year-old boys and stuff in fields just for fun and stuff like that. I mean, that kind of stuff has that happened?
I don't know about that. I don't have any verifiable documentary evidence to that, but I do have verifiable documentary evidence that Israel takes between 700 and 1,000 hostages every year, ages 10 to 14. Okay. And, they call them prisoners. 80% of these hostages, prisoners, have never been to trial, never been actually charged with a crime. Okay. They've never had their rights. Sometimes these children who speak Arabic will be forced to sign a confession written in Hebrew. And then given long sentences, 4-year, 8-year, 10-year, 15-year sentences. They go in at 13. Now, you've seen some of these people that went in as boys, okay? And what they'll do is like somebody will throw a rock or something like that, okay? And then the police will come and arrest this kid. Maybe he's 18, maybe he's 20, whatever, all right? He's technically an adult. Then they'll snatch a little 10-year-old boy that was just standing there watching the whole thing go down and take him in with them, and they'll threaten him and say, "You're going to testify and you're going to be a witness that you saw this man throw a stone at the police." Okay.
Yeah.
And they say, if you don't, then we're going to charge you for throwing a stone at the police.
Yeah.
Okay. And then they'll give him a document in Hebrew and make him sign it. He doesn't read Hebrew; he speaks and reads Arabic. So this whole thing is just unbelievable. So when you talk about Hamas took 260 terrorists or hostages or how many ever there were, right? Israel takes almost that much every year. There are 7,000 people in Israeli prisons right now. 2,000 of them are children.
Yeah,
they're hostages. They're not prisoners. It's you can see how racist this is. Hamas takes people captive and they're hostages. Israel takes people captive and they're prisoners.
And why did Hamas, on that horrible October 7th massacre, why did they go after the rave party and all that? Taking grandmas on golf carts and taking these. I guess the grandmas weren't at the rave party, but
good question.
What was going on there?
There's a newspaper, a news organization called Haaretz in Israel. It's an Israeli publication. There's also another one called the Times of Israel. Okay. Yeah. These are two reputable. Haaretz is the oldest newspaper in Israel. All right. These are both reputable newspapers. So after all this happens, we're going like, how did all these civilians come? How did all these civilians get killed? Well, as it turns out, Israel has something that is called the Hannibal Doctrine. Okay. The Hannibal Doctrine is their policy for what happens when Israelis are taken hostage. Okay.
Yeah.
And they were giving the helicopter pilots and the tank commanders were giving what's called a mass Hannibal order. The Hannibal order says that when Hamas or any other enemy takes hostages, you shoot at everybody because you don't know who is who. So you fire into the kibbutz. One, they were just recently talking about this group of women who are tank commanders, okay? And they were fighting in this battle, a group of 5 or 7 of them, all right? And they were told, this one young lady says, we were told, okay, to fire into the kibbutz. And she said, I asked, are there civilians there? I said, we don't care. Fire into the kibbutz. Now, if you look at the damage done to the kibbutz, and you look at the damage done to some of those bodies that they say were burned beyond recognition, and I've seen them, Hamas does not have the kind of weaponry that can burn a body like that. A grenade cannot do that. Obviously, an AK-47 cannot do that. Okay? Throwing gasoline on a body and setting it on fire cannot burn a body to that degree. Okay? Where it's just a charred, piece of charcoal. All right? If you pour gasoline over the body, it burns until the gasoline is burned up. And then it stops. So the body is half burned here and burned here, but it's not completely charred all the way through to the bone. Okay? Only hellfire missiles can burn a body to that degree.
That's why they're called hellfire, right?
Yes. And only, a tank round, all right, can blow up a kibbutz to the extent that their little anti-tank RPGs or whatever they're firing cannot blow up an entire kibbutz and burn it to the ground. Sorry, you throw a grenade into the building, it blows up a room. All right, it doesn't destroy the whole building. All right. So only a tank round can do that, and only a hellfire missile can do that. And so yes, they interviewed the helicopter pilots, they interviewed the tank commanders. Haaretz did this, the Israeli media did this. Then the Israeli Defense Force and the police investigated this and interviewed the helicopter pilots and tank commanders, and they all testified that they had received the Hannibal order, a mass Hannibal order to shoot on their own people, even the ones coming from the concert.
Wow.
And that's documented by their own media.
Yeah.
Now, so did Hamas kill some civilians? I believe they probably did. And I think there's documentary evidence to support that. How many civilians did they shoot? Now, Haaretz also has listed all the casualties. There's 1,136, I believe, okay? And they have them divided up demographically, so you know who the soldiers are, who the police are, who the children are, who the adults are. I counted nearly 400 military and police targets, okay?
Yeah.
According to international law, if you are, oppressed, living in what might be described as an open-air prison, open-air kind of, you have the legal right to use violence against a military target, okay? We know that Hamas did that, and they killed about 400 military and police, okay? And that's documented, again, by Israeli intelligence. Now, that leaves approximately 800 to 900 people. I counted very few children. I counted less than 10 children, and I'm being generous, that their own media has said were killed, okay? I know at least some of those children were killed by Israeli fire because one of the girls whose body was burned to a charred under the rubble in a kibbutz. His sister lived, and she testified that, yes, we were hostages inside the kibbutz. And they had our hands tied behind our back. But they did not harm us. And it was the Israeli helicopter and tanks that shot into the kibbutz that set the building on fire that burned my brother alive. It was not Hamas. Okay. So in the Haaretz report, I counted less than 10. All right. And I'm being generous. Maybe there's more because there's still bodies missing. Okay. So I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Look, killing one child is too much for me. All right. I'm not down with the killing of any civilians. It's illegal. It's a war crime. All right. And it's abhorrent. But we have to look at the facts, okay? Military targets, almost 400. Children, less than 10, all right? The other civilians, now we know Hamas killed civilians. We know Israelis killed civilians, their own civilians, as part of the Hannibal order. How many? We don't know, okay? But they are both guilty for killing civilians. And in Israel's case, killing their own people. You talk about human shields, they killed their own people.
One would say that the Hannibal doctrine doesn't mean you kill the civilian intentionally, though. You just shoot to kill whatever, right? Is that
you kill everybody that's moving because you don't know who's who?
Yeah. So they're not trying to kill. Just to be clear, they're not trying to kill their civilians.
Right.
It's
but they fired on cars. They fired on cars. You can see the cars, and you can see the charred bodies in the back. Okay, sitting in the back seat, and you know that a RPG does not burn bodies to that degree. It just doesn't. Okay, so you know this was a Hellfire missile or this was a tank round. Okay, and they shot at cars coming from the festival, coming from the rave. Now you would have to assume. Why would the tank commander ask, are there civilians in there? If you didn't already assume there must be civilians, right? So they didn't know, but they must have assumed, or they wouldn't have asked.
Yeah. What about the of course we still, Netanyahu said we're going to have a time to investigate the failures, because how many hours was it that they failed to act before they came in?
There were several hours. Now all this is really interesting because obviously some people were closer and were able to act sooner than that, but to have a full-scale defense, it took several hours. But now here's what's interesting to me. When I was in Egypt, I arrived in Egypt on the 17th of September. Around the 19th, my apartment is on the 10th floor, and it overlooks one of the military training facilities. It has an airport, tower, everything. Okay. I went out to dinner, came home, was taking a little nap, and I woke up and I heard planes flying around. I went outside on my balcony. I looked up. There were like 22 F-16s flying around my neighborhood. So I thought it was like an air show because it was coming up on a military holiday in October 6th, but it's still a few weeks away. So I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. So I keep counting planes. I keep counting more and more F-16s flying around, doing maneuvers and so forth. Okay. And then I see a personnel plane, carrier plane, come, with a military escort of F-16s. Then I'm looking up into the sky, seeing if there are any more planes going to pop out of the sky. And I see hundreds of paratroopers coming out of the clouds, Egyptian paratroopers. That happened about 3 times a week for the first 2 weeks I was there until October 3rd when I went up to Alexandria. Okay. Now, all the official reports say that Egypt warned Israel 3 times prior to this attack occurring, stating that something big was about to happen. Okay. So Israel knew about this. It's indisputable that they knew about this. And Egypt was doing, training exercises, preparing for this in case it leaked over the border. I saw it with my own eyes. Now, maybe it could have been something else. I don't have, I don't have official documents, but I have lived in that apartment for 2 years. I've lived as it's approaching the same military holiday rather, and I've never seen any exercises that large or to that degree. Secondly, I'm in the kibbutzes, 300 meters away from the border, the fence, and the wall. There are soldiers that are called surveillance soldiers. They are called the eyes of the army. Okay, they report directly to intelligence officials. They watch the border 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Okay, for 3 months, the two girls that survived the attack. There was only two of these surveillance soldiers that survived the attack that were present on the day of the attack. They testified to Haaretz and other news organizations that for 3 months they warned the intelligence officials that something was going to happen. They witnessed the planting of explosives along the fence line. They witnessed drills about how to breach the fence. They witnessed drills about how to take over tanks and so forth. Okay? In other words, they were preparing for the attack 3 months outside in plain view of the surveillance soldiers.
And why would the question? Why would Hamas be doing those drills in plain sight?
Right? Yeah, exactly.
I don't trust. Yeah. I don't trust any of these sides on this.
I agree with you 100%. Now, there were two surveillance soldiers that were on leave. In other words, they weren't at the kibbutz on the day of the attack. They confirmed what these other two surveillance soldiers who were there on the day of the attack and that survived, they confirmed everything they said. They said for 3 months we warned them and they did nothing, and yet we were the ones that were murdered first.
Wow.
Now that's documented by Israel's own media, reputable media, the oldest media.
Must be anti-Semitic according to Ben Shapiro.
Well, now Netanyahu's government, the Likud party, is trying to shut Haaretz down.
Like literally shut it down, huh?
Shut him down.
Yeah.
So,
what about, you're a minister of the gospel. Do you agree, or what is your take on Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on October 8th saying you must remember what Amalek has done to you? Yeah.
Well, that means, I wrote about this prior to him saying that when Israel was up to about 4,000 dead, killing Palestinians, about 4,000 Palestinians, half of which were children. I said he's already exceeded the Old Testament eye for eye, tooth for tooth, the lex talionis, which is, the idea that your response must be proportionate. They take an eye, you take an eye. They take a hand, you take a hand. They kill 1,100, you kill 1,100. Okay. Well, they had tripled that by the time I wrote this article. And I said they're rapidly approaching another Old Testament principle, which is called the ban. And the ban was kill every man, woman, and child. Okay, exterminate the population. All right, that's what God told Israel to do to Amalek: kill everyone, even kill the farm animals. Nothing survives. Okay. And that's what Israel's doing. There's no question that's what they're doing. That was their intent to do. And in fact, if you look at David Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel, the first prime minister, he had that plan already in action. Their plan was always to either move the Palestinians out of Palestine or to kill them.
Yeah. Well, what's your response to the Christians who say, well, Palestine, there was no Palestine government. There was no Palestine state there when Ben-Gurion and fellows came in.
Right. Okay. So that is the most irrelevant thing that I've ever heard in my life. Forget Palestine. Forget the name Palestine. Okay. That probably comes from the Romans anyways. Okay. There were indigenous people living there. All right. During the Ottoman Empire. All right. For multiple generations under the Ottoman Empire. Okay, they ruled over what? Almost 200 years there, right? The British after that. After World War I, the age of empire was finished, basically, after World War I. And we entered into the nation-state arrangement of geopolitics. The same indigenous people that were there, living there under the Ottoman Empire, lived there under the British Mandate Palestine. That's what it was called, British Mandate Palestine. Doesn't matter what it's called. There were indigenous people living there. Doesn't matter if they were the original indigenous people either. They had been there for generations. They had homes there that they had built. They owned land there because, see, prior, it wasn't until the later Ottoman Empire that you could actually own private property. That's one, and the Ottoman Empire allowed private property to be bought because it made it easier to collect taxes. Okay, it wasn't like some big idealistic thing that they wanted to, foster the ownership of private property. It was just, no, it makes taxes easier to collect. So they allowed the rights to buy private property. People had property there. People owned it. People had houses there. They owned it. All right. When there were three phases of Jewish immigration during, the later part of the Ottoman Empire and during the British Mandate Palestine. The first one was like 25,000. The second one was like 50,000. The third one was like 75,000. And then you have World War I. Then you have a couple more immigrations after that. Some larger, some smaller. But in 1948, no sooner than Ben Gurion declared Israel a state, because the UN in 1947 had given them the legitimacy to be a state, and then in 1948 they declared themselves their independence. As soon as they did that, they launched a massive displacement of people, forcibly displaced 750,000, whatever you want to call them, indigenous people, Palestinians. They took their homes and they took their land. 700. That's indisputable. 750. Think about that. 750,000 people were taken from their homes. This is the Trail of Tears in America, right? It's the same thing.
What about the interview, like Netanyahu, when he was interviewed by Jordan Peterson? He said, look, people, what would you do if, you are forcibly removed from your home, and then a long time from there, other people come in and move into your house, and when you come back, finally, free to go back to your home, there's people in your house that weren't there before you were. That's what he says.
Well, that's just ludicrous because, okay, so you're saying that nobody should live in your home for 3,000 years? Okay, the Jewish people left 3,000 years ago, and so now, that's still my home? That's ludicrous. That just carries no weight at all. These were people that were living there. They weren't absent from there and then tried to come back. They were living there. Okay? And then they were forcibly moved. 750,000. And they're still taking homes today in the West Bank. They take their homes, the soldiers come, they take the people out, and they tear their houses down. They build new houses over the top of them. I've seen video after video after video after video of Palestinian peoples just weeping and crying because the soldiers are tearing their houses down with bulldozers.
What about some of the settlements that took place, or places that we don't hear about as much, like the folks in Iraq or Baghdad that came to Israel?
Say that again. I'm sorry, I missed that question.
What about the how does that play into with, like, when you're talking about the founding of Israel and the settlers? What about the folks that came over from places like Baghdad and everything? These the folks that came to.
Yeah, those people lost everything that they owned in Baghdad, and that was intentional because they didn't want these people to have the Israelis did not want these Jews from Baghdad or anywhere else in the Middle East to have the ability to go back to their homes. Okay. And the first ones that went there, see, some of the poorer class went voluntarily, or they were bribed to go. Okay. Many of the poorer class.
How did they get to go in the first place?
Well, okay. At that time, Iran was friendly to Israel. Okay. And so Iran allowed free passage, even though it was illegal to immigrate from Baghdad. Iran allowed free passage. They allowed border crossing.
Iraq or Iran? Which?
Iran.
Okay.
So Iraqis would go through Iran to Israel, okay? And they would bribe the border guards, and they would bribe the poor people who would go. Then later on, they would send several of those poor people back to Iraq as spies, okay? And put them on the payroll. They would become, sort of part of the Israeli underground. And they were the ones that were causing trouble in the Jewish communities, trying to, disrupt the Jewish communities so that more people would immigrate. But so they knew that these people would lose everything. That was part of the plan. Okay. And then when they got there, some of the Iraqis that actually got to Israel first, they told their relatives, do not come. This is horrible. We went from living in nice middle-class homes and we're living in tents now.
So they went by plane, basically, right? Is that right?
No, by car or bus or whatever. Yeah. Some went by plane.
Iraq is closer to Israel on the map than Iran. So how did they go from Iraq to Iran to Israel?
Yeah, well, that would have to be by plane, but some Iraqis went by regular transportation.
Okay.
So what happened was the relatives got over there and they said, look, don't come. The conditions are horrible.
This is in the 50s or 40s, or what is this?
This was in the 50s, right after it was declared a nation. Yeah.
Okay. And then there's I don't know much about it, but I've heard from, some articles and so forth. There's a memoir by a professor, Avi Shlaim, who was an Iraqi Jew, right? And he wrote a memoir that kind of explained the precipitating events that caused them to be moved to Israel.
Right. Yeah. And he's, again, a professor at Oxford of, Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Israeli history. He's one of the nicest, soft-spokenest man. There's actually a video. He has a video out. It's on YouTube. All you got to do is Google his name and it'll come up. And where he talks about, what's going on in Israel. Yeah. He is against Zionism. He is, ardently against the Zionist movement, as many Jews are today. This is the only thing people, especially Christian Zionists, don't understand, is that many Jews are anti-Zionist. And here's the thing. Zionism is not Judaism. To be anti-Zionist is not to be anti-Semitic. And that's what Netanyahu and the Likud party and many of the Jews in Israel want us to believe, that if you're anti-Israel, you're anti-Jew or anti-Semitic. And that is not the case. Okay, I'm for all races of people, including Jews, to thrive, to prosper, to have freedom, to move about wherever they want, all right, to have self-determination, all right. But I am not for the nation state of Israel. They are an apartheid state. They are engaged in genocide, and they are engaged in ethnic cleansing. 3 of the largest humanitarian organizations all concur with that assessment. One of them is B'Tselem, which is a Jewish humanitarian organization in Israel, and they characterize the nation state of Israel with those terms.
What about the position, though, that you're supposed to, a lot of these evangelicals and so forth believe that you have to bless Israel, or they associate that with the the modern state of Israel. They take Genesis and the Abrahamic promise. Is that what was in mind when the state of Israel was created with Ben Gurion?
Well, see, that's where they get into the whole idea of confusing the peoples with nation state. There is no such thing as a modern nation state in the Bible, okay? In the sense where 3 European countries sit around a table with a map on it and start drawing lines around countries and say, this is sovereign territory, this is sovereign territory, this is sovereign territory. That's how Iraq was created, all right? There was no Iraq, all right? Europeans sat around a table and drew lines around countries and said, this is what you are now. You're Iraqi. No, I'm Kurdish, or no, I'm Chaldean. I'm Assyrian. No, you're Iraqi now. Sorry. We're in control here. And so that whole idea of a nation state, which is basically a nation state, is a social imaginary. It only exists. It doesn't have concrete existence. It only exists because we say it exists. It only exists if it's recognized by another nation state. Okay. And so many Christian or Zionist Christians think, that, in the Bible, they had nation states. No, they had tribes, they had city states, they had kingdoms, and they had empires. Okay. But there was no sense of a nation state. The idea of a nation state did not exist in the Bible. So the biblical Israel could not have been a nation in the sense of the modern nation state of Israel. It's impossible. Didn't exist in those days. Secondly, these were peoples. Abraham was a people. Okay. God promised him a people. In fact, he promised him that they'd be a blessing to the Gentiles, which they were a blessing to the Gentiles, okay, as you and I are proof of. But that did not promise them a state. Israel was a people, okay. Now, God did promise Abraham territory, okay. But again, if we look at the borders of that territory that he was promised, it goes from the Tigris to the Euphrates. It goes all the way up into southern Lebanon, goes across the Jordan into the modern nation state of present-day Jordan, and it goes all the way to the Nile River in Egypt. Right? So if Israel was going to be biblical Israel, we would have to literally change the boundaries and probably go to war with 5 different countries.
But there's a lot of Christians that have been taught that, well, yeah, Pastor Jim, that's the ideal scenario. We're not there yet. We got a lot of problems with a lot of people and countries in the way, and we're politically correct. So that's why we're not there yet. But those people have a right to that land. So they're being gracious, taking the small sliver that they got. So what's your problem?
Yeah.
They've got a biblical claim to the land, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
you teach theology. I just want you to put on your theology hat for a moment.
Here's the thing, like the Torah Jews would say, remember, the Torah Jews are the ones that said the Zionists are Jewish heretics and that the Zionists should be excommunicated from Judaism. All right. These are the biblical Torah Jews, the ones that believe in Torah.
Yeah.
That is to believe in the law. All right. To believe in the Old Testament. And what they say is that, yes, God in his timing will bring the people of Israel back to the land, but it will not be through the apparatus of a man-made nation state.
Yeah.
It will be a miracle, and that miracle will be simultaneous with the coming of the Messiah.
Right.
Okay, now that's their first coming, right? Now, it would be our second coming. That's their first coming. And so the Jews are not to go in the land. What the Jews said when Theodor Herschel, the founder of Zionism, when he wanted to have the first National Zionist Conference in Munich, all the Munich rabbis got together and they wrote a paper that they published in the newspaper. And they condemned Zionism. And they said it is not consistent with what the Torah teaches, that Jews are supposed to live in the country where they reside, in other words, in their exile, in their diaspora, and be good citizens in that country to help that country, this is Jeremiah, right? Help that country prosper. Build your homes, put down roots, be the best of all citizens in that country where you reside until Messiah comes and miraculously uproots his people and brings them back to their homeland. Okay. That's what Torah Jews believe.
Right.
And so there is no promise that God will use the apparatus of a nation state to using militaristic force to bring his people back to Palestine.
I've heard some Zionists say, well, you know, God can work through wicked kings. So yeah, United Nations had a role in this, but God still works within that sovereignly to create this miracle of Israel's return.
Right. Yeah, I mean, okay, God could. Okay, I'm just saying, I'm just parroting what the Torah Jews say, the Jews that believe in the Old Testament and practice the Old Testament. That's what they believe. They believe that this will be a miraculous event, that it will not be through the apparatus of a nation state, man-made, and that it will coincide with the return of the Messiah, or with the coming of the Messiah.
Right. So they're saying because the Messiah is not back, they shouldn't be having a political state.
They should not be trying to establish a state.
Yeah. Which it kind of in keeping with what the folks of Jesus's time were saying too, right? They're like, if you're the Messiah, you better take, kingship over the land, right? And overthrow the occupiers.
Yes, exactly. Right.
So they're kind of in the same mode of expectation there.
Right.
Well, Pastor Jim, I really appreciate your time. And, these are some complicated topics. And I think that you've done well to kind of, break through some of the cloudiness on these subjects and try to help provide some facts on the historical basis for where we're at today.
Well, it's been a joy. I've enjoyed it very much, David.
I appreciate it. And folks can follow your work at various websites. Just type in, what would you say is the best place for people to follow your work, or email?
Yeah, so I have the Aquila Report, antiwar.com are the main ones that I try to write for. Also, I have articles on the American Thinker and maybe one article on American Greatness. But antiwar.com is the one that I try to feed most of my work to, and then the Aquila Report.
Well, thanks again.
And then they can find me at equipmentpastors.com.
Well, what's your pastoral final thought for folks, fellow Christians confused about these matters? Any final words?
Yeah, look, as I said in one of my articles, it's easy to be a Christian Zionist, okay? Maybe it's worse than that. It's lazy to be a Christian Zionist. If you study the history of Zionism, you will find out that the Zionists were rationalistic Enlightenment people who thought that the best thing that the Enlightenment provided was to finally erode rabbinic dominance over Judaism. So they celebrated the idea that the effect of the Enlightenment on Judaism was to get rid of rabbinic, the dominance of the rabbis over Judaism. All right. So, and of course, the rabbis are the center of Judaism in terms of interpreting and following what Judaism is supposed to be. All right. And the Zionists celebrated, right, that the Enlightenment basically eroded rabbinic dominance from Judaism. In other words, they could make it say whatever they wanted to. And so Zionist is not a religious movement. It's a secular, rationalistic movement that was part of the Enlightenment project, that was swept up into that fervor of nation-state nationalism that was sweeping the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. Has nothing to do with the Bible.
So that the Christians should stand in solidarity with every human person involved in that dispute, and not the political machinations that are built on ideologies that are not in keeping with the Bible, right?
Yeah. Love the Palestinian people, love the Jewish people, but understand that Judaism is not Zionism.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, my brother. It's been great talking with you, David, as always. Hope
Take
to
care.
talk soon.